welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live in Ottawa, Ontario. Today was the Digital History Open House here at the University of Ottawa, a couple floors up from where we are sitting. Very pleased to be joined by the keynote speaker from that event, John Bonnett from Brock University. Welcome to the show.
Hello, glad to be here.
So you were here talking about ways in which we can reimagine the past, where the discipline is today, and normally around this time of year, we would be at Congress. I'm not going this year, and normally Congress is where I do an episode about the state of the field, and since I won't do it this year, I figured this is a good opportunity because that talk was really, I thought, illuminating on the state of the field, and I like the way you structured it in that you started with a way to reimagine the past, and you talked about the animal turn a little bit, and you said, you're not really an expert on this, but this is something, the animal turn, I've read about a little bit, and I'm by no means an expert on it either, and I've always thought it kind of weird, and that it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but the way you explained it actually helped a little bit.
Right.
So for people who are listening who might not be familiar with the animal turn, how would you frame it in just like quickly, so that someone who's not a historian, even because to explain the animal turn in history to a non-historian, I imagine would be a very difficult task.
Yeah, I would say starting out that, I agree with you. Just to repeat, I'm not an expert in the animal turn. You'd want somebody like Dan Vandersummers or somebody who is an expert and a leading proponent in this field for that. Part of the reason I'm interested in the animal turn, just to start also, is that, in history and the humanities, there are multiple proclamations of a turn here or a revolution there. And they come and go and nobody pays much attention. But this was the first one that, for me personally, spoke to me in a way that none of the other turns have. It was, when I didn't even know a great deal about the animal turn until about 3 months ago.
Right.
And then I read Vandersummers' piece on the American Historical Review blog. And it was just, the reaction was, oh my God, this is something in line with what I've been thinking about for a number of years. And so that was the part of the appeal for it. And the other part of the appeal was at Brock, we had at our Humanities Research Institute, we have a conference every semester where we celebrate the end of term, and some colleagues will get up and give a talk. And this one happened to be devoted to the animal turn, and it was just one of those things where it was like, oh my God, I need to participate in this. This is really interesting. What can I do, and what can I contribute? And I ended up giving a paper there and then a version of it here. But as far as what the animal turn is, the way I characterized it in my paper, and I'd say most proponents in the animal turn would state that our intention is to bring animals into history, that there needs to be a growing recognition that germs matter.
Right.
Or, animals were a part and parcel and participant in history. Or that ecological systems or planetary systems have had a bearing. It's not something historians haven't known before. I mean, you read your annal historians and, references to the longue durée. Well, we know that this is something important. But there's an emphasis on it now, it seems to me, that there wasn't before. The other one is something I'm not sure most animal turn historians would necessarily agree with, but it's the way I glommed onto it. And it's, to me, the animal turn represents a way of thinking about history and historical context that takes us to areas that are not very familiar or comfortable for us. So I'd say the default wisdom of the discipline since, say, World War I has been, we're materialist. We look for causes that we know. We look for proximate connections. This is how you construct serious history. It seems to me that the animal turn is pointing us to some areas that are a little alarming, a little uncomfortable, but potentially quite transformative or different in terms of where we may be going as a profession, in terms of the kind of context that we describe when we try to reconstruct the past. And so here I'm thinking about two things. One is panpsychism, which is the philosophy that argues that sentience or agency is actually far more widespread than we traditionally have acknowledged. And
Yes.
things that are, we use terms like dumb as a stump.
Right.
Well, if you are aware of, say, some interesting research on trees, such as described by Peter Wohlleben in his book, The Hidden Life of Trees, stumps are actually pretty smart.
Right, yeah.
And so are their neighbors that are alive that are helping to keep that stump alive.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk about bird brains, again, we tend to associate a lack of deep agency or life
Yep.
to at least some categories of animals. Well, it turns out birds are creating symphonies that are equivalent in complexity to 19th century Western symphonies and using tools and doing all these kinds of things. And again, birds are actually pretty smart. So that's leading me to, with that degree of sentience in domains, whether it's single-celled organisms or trees or birds or whatever, that is making it more plausible for me to think about a context in which we live and move, where there is consciousness and agency. And there are some in philosophy that argue that sense of agency extends all the way down to electrons and extends as far afield as the planet, potentially the cosmos itself. So, the question I've got is, well, what do I do with that?
Right. That's the thing, right? Sitting there listening to you talk is sort of thinking about it. I can buy into the idea, I think, of these things being sentient because they're living and breathing. So of course, like there has to be some level of something that allows them to do that, right? Like a plant is in the ground, it doesn't it's not static. It's always changing and growing.
Yeah.
So of course it's alive, and we've acknowledged that it's alive. The thing that I always talk to like my vegetarian friends about is when they say, "Oh, how can you eat an animal? It's this living, breathing thing." And I say, well, so is a tomato.
Yes.
It's a living, breathing thing. It just doesn't have a face. Right? That's really the key difference to me. I mean,
it's more than that. I mean, that plant, plants learn from experience.
Right.
Plants communicate. Plants seem to have a sense of species identity. They seem to have a sense of group identity. They communicate with other plants. They seem to harness something akin to an internet, what the journal Science calls the Wood Wide Web, where they connect with I can't remember what mushrooms should be called, but the mushroom-like plants that connect. Fungus, the fungal networks, underground fungal networks, and these things are huge. And trees will communicate via these fungal networks. So when you're dealing with a world like that, all of a sudden it looks very, very different. And how do you then, as the historian who's generally limited, one's scope to just human activity generally, and I think our general disposition as a discipline is we don't connect what we do in human history with natural history. We keep the two domains apart.
Right.
But that division's becoming less and less viable to maintain the more we learn about how germs build these large-scale settlements that were characterized by division of labor. So really, are they all that different? And what is it that we use to justify or distinct in this to the point where our history is then to be kept separate from the history of everything else?
Yeah, there's the universality of it, that we're all living together in some form. And when you talked about the idea of plants creating defenses, right? You use the image of a giraffe eating from a tree, like one of those. I call them umbrella trees because I don't actually know what they're called.
I forget. Acacia trees. I forget.
Right. Yeah. But so those trees, like we would look at it normally and just say, oh, well, the tree has evolved in that setting.
Yeah.
To do this, and we don't attach any agency to it. We don't say that the tree as the species has learned to do this. We just say, oh, it just evolved that way, and we almost take it for granted. But we don't take into account the process through which that happened. Yet, when human beings say, if we take, say, northern communities, the way they learned how to survive in the north, we attach the agency to it and say they learned how to do this and they adapted to the environment. But we don't do that with other objects because we don't give them agency. And I can't really wrap my head around why, other than they don't have those objects don't have the ability to communicate with us, right? There's no language in which they can actually say to us, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so much of history is looking at the words that were left by people, right?
Yes.
Like at least traditional histories. And trees don't have words, right? Animals don't leave us words. And so,
Well, that's the interesting thing. Maybe they do, and it's just we don't know.
we don't know the language.
We don't know the language. But
Yeah.
I mean, the trees do, in fact, communicate.
Right.
And in fact, to use the example of the acacia tree that you're dealing with, when that tree is being consumed by a giraffe, it understands that it's being consumed by a giraffe, and it responds to that by filling the leaves with compounds that make that leaf taste bitter to the giraffe.
Right.
Further, it releases, I think it's a methylene gas or something, that then lets its neighbors know that, hey, there are giraffes around, you better take countermeasures to make your leaves taste awful to the giraffes. Mm-hmm. And the giraffes know that this is happening, so when this process of salad sabotage goes on,
Yeah.
they know enough to leave and proceed like 100 meters down to some place that has not received the alert from the acacia tree, so that they can again resume their meals. So there is a communication process going on. And to what extent that we're able then to communicate with them, well, God knows. Who knows how that's going to be. One interesting thing about it, though, is that potentially that knowledge will have a bearing on things like vectors that we create for dealing with bacteria, because our standard method for dealing with bacteria now is to create drugs that destroy the bacteria.
Yeah.
But Princeton biologist Bonnie Bassler has noted that there's another template that we could use, which is basically jamming the communication between the various microbes.
Right.
The various microbes, when they decide to attack an organism, in which the host organism, they vote. Mm-hmm. And the way they vote is through communication. Well, if we create a process where we can hinder them from communicating,
right,
they don't attack. And
right.
so that's another way to stop the spread of disease.
Right, which is really interesting in terms of like something like cancer, right, where if there's possible then to take the cancer cells and have them not be able to communicate with the other cells or not attack the other cells rather than actually attack them themselves, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm always stunned when, and I haven't been in a lot of situations where people are going through chemo, but like the amount of protections that the people administering the chemo need to take so that they're safe, and yet
Yes.
we're pumping this into another human being's body,
Yes.
and essentially to kill pretty much everything in there. If there's a way to just prevent the communication between the different cells, it's such a safer way to address the issue. And it strikes me as a historian, though, what is interesting about it is in doing this and recognizing the sentient activity, it almost minimizes or it takes away from the role of human beings a little bit, right? And like you said, as historians, we've been so focused on people, and now this forces us to reimagine what the world is. That it's not this planet that we control. It's this planet with which we engage on a daily basis, and that's to me a very radical shift.
Yes, it is, and I frankly have no idea where that's going to take us, that shift. And in my talk this morning, I said, well, historians are generally reluctant to make forecasts, and so I forecast to the extent that I could, but where this is going to take us, I have no idea. But all I can say is that at least personally, it's a route I find appealing. It's a way of thinking about history that I think is very new and very different than anything that I've learned up to date. And it just strikes me as also potentially one of the most intellectually fruitful. There's something to build on here.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of historians, particularly younger ones, are looking for something like that. And
Right.
this gives us a basis then to, our job as a discipline is always to look at the past and try to find something new, or to
Right.
to see if there's another context, another narrative that helps us to gain better purchase on the past, or more useful purchase on the past. And this strikes me as a pretty good way to go.
A really good one. And just even today in the news, I don't know if you've paid attention. I know you're on the road, so my news consumption gets always screwed up when I'm not at home. But there was a case here in Ottawa where they had to evacuate a home. A couple people got sick because they had coral. They had purchased this coral that was emitting some sort of poisonous gas. But you generally you would see that and say, oh, well, the people made the mistake by not knowing it was poisonous. But you could also look at it saying the coral is defending itself by putting this out.
Yes.
Right? And that's an interesting way to look at it. But then you also try to tie in then the digital side of it. Because, the digital, it's very interesting to me that you go from talking about the sentient activity of things to this digital world in which people are concerned that digital tools maybe will become sentient and sort of control us if they're not already controlling us to a certain degree. But how does this all tie in? Like, how do we tie in the digital with a reimagining of the past and understanding a sentient activity on the part of things that traditionally we haven't done?
Right. One way you can think about history is a concern with how one thing connects with another.
Mm-hmm.
How one individual connects with another, how one social system connects with another, one social category connects with another, and so on. And how all those, that then results in an incredibly complex set of communications and interactions and whatever, and out of that complex comes the historical events that we attempt to understand and describe.
Right.
So, the animal turn, to my mind, suggests a context that's going to make that job ever more complicated. But potentially it will also provide a source of ideas to help us gain better purchase on how human collectives operate, how they evolve, how they unfold, whatever. So one example of that might be something that the social sciences already do, which is they study the interaction of germs, the field of epidemiology. They create concepts in mathematics that potentially are fruitful for understanding how human social collectives work. So think, ideas like information cascades and so forth. Benjamin Ray in Virginia found very striking parallels between how epidemics spread and the spread of the basically the social craze associated with the Salem witch trials. And the spatial patterns there were very, very similar. So the natural world seems to me to present a source of ideas, almost a library of forms and patterns that potentially we can use to gain greater purchase on the past. But in terms of understanding how one thing connects to another and how social collectives work and unfold dynamically, I think computation presents us with an interesting set of tools. And those are called agent-based simulations. And what they do is they take an identified system, define each actor, give those actors a set of rules, define how those actors work with each other and with their environment, and then they see what kind of patterns emerge in this digital simulation. And the reason why a lot of social scientists, historical scientists, historians care about this is they often produce patterns that are strikingly similar with what we see in either historical data or contemporary data or the archaeological record or what have you. So they've been used, for example, to try and gain greater purchase about why the Anasazi disappeared from what's now Arizona. Your namesake at Carleton, Sean Graham, has used it to study the emergence of social violence in Rome. There's been very interesting work on the Battle of Trafalgar and how is it that the British were able to obtain such a striking victory. And all of this has been done through the use of simulations that show how individuals and aggregates of individuals connect with each other, and hypotheses are generated to explain how they've connected with each other. And I think by extension we can use that approach and that technology to examine how human collectives interact with germ collectives.
Right.
Or ecosystems, or other things like that. We have systems of systems connecting, interacting, morphing, adapting, all those kinds of things. And I think agent-based simulations will help us gain greater purchase in terms of understanding that.
Right. And it's weird because I've always considered history as a humanity, right? Like, I've always said that to people. But in this framework, it's not. it is a social science, I think, like you say, right? It's taking away the exclusive domain of human beings in studying the past, and the digital component, I think, just assists in that by giving a broader data set from which to work, would be my take on that. And for me, on a personal note, it changes the entire way I have to conceive of the discipline then.
Well, I think it doesn't necessarily detract. I mean, I think there's always going to be a rule for what we do in the humanities, which is hermeneutic. We're still going to be deeply invested in text. And if anything, we're going to need that to assist us in building simulations and effectively deploying computation. What I think simulations and other things do is they provide another venue, another vector to understand the past, and that vector is experimentation.
Right.
So we create an experiment, i.e., we create a fake system, and we see if that fake system acts in the same way or produces the same pattern that a historic system did. And if that hypothesis produces a pattern that is similar to what we know happened in history, then we've got a pretty good basis for believing that hypothesis is actually valid.
Right. But then at the same time, does it not, to a certain degree, almost, if we do this and we discover that germs or whatever, that we all act the same in some way, right? That initially, when you were talking this morning, my initial thought was that there's got to be some sort of religious meaning to all this, right? If we're all just cells and beings, right? Like that's one. But let's not get into that, because that, I think, is a larger issue. But two, it almost takes away from human agency in a way, does it not? Because we all like to believe that we are masters of our own destiny and that we have say in what we're doing and that free will is a real thing. But if we're all just behaving the same way as trees or other, even a single cell organism, the way it does its own thing, like, does it not take away some human agency as opposed to give agency then to these other beings that we haven't believed to be sentient before?
I suppose, well, if you view history as a zero-sum game where, the acquisition of animal agency detracts from our dignity or our agency or what have you, sure. That's fine. On the other hand, if we define human agency as the performance of certain goals, like staying healthy, recognizing that we have potential partners out there or potential opponents that we need to thwart, our agency is enhanced by viewing the world this way, not undermined. I think the fact of agency is not undermined by the recognition that there are other agents out there that we just didn't know exist before.
Okay, how about the uniqueness then? I mean, is there a unique quality to being human? Because I think we've always thought that human beings, you always see the top of the food chain type idea, or the idea of consciousness or verbal written language. Like these things that human beings do that other things haven't, or at least we haven't discovered the existence of, at least, that we always like to think of ourselves as unique on this planet, and if not the planet, maybe even just in the world, right? The constant search for intelligent life, as people always say, right? That's always been the search, and the fact that we haven't necessarily found it in a concrete way provides us with some, I don't know, maybe it's just an ego thing, that we're unique.
Well, yeah, and in many ways I think that really is the nub of the issue. Why do we care if we're not unique anymore?
Right.
If we're not all that unique in the grand scheme of Earth's ecosystem, that's not going to keep me up at night particularly. In fact, I find that a wondrous thing. To me, it actually adds and enriches to my view of how the world is. It actually makes it a far more interesting place.
Yeah.
I think in the West we have a higher investment in this idea, in part because of the Christian idea of we're all created in the image of God, in Imago Dei, and that then means that we're special.
Right.
And I think potentially we have acquired or inherited that idea, and we still have an investment to one degree or another in that idea. But that is not let's put it this way, I don't have an emotional connection to that idea. That's not determinative to me. The same text that says that we are created in the image of God also points to actually, St. Paul talks about a world where the creation actually seems to have a sense of agency and investment in history,
right,
waiting for its culmination. So there's all sorts of theology and philosophy that you could bite or chew with when you're trying to come to grips with all of this. I don't particularly feel upset by the fact that man is no longer the measure of all things, or humans now. Humans are not the measure of all things. That doesn't really bother me particularly. In fact, it might help us to behave better if we didn't realize we were the only actor on stage.
That is true. We might behave better, especially if we consider the planet as an actor. As various things on the planet, but the planet in and of itself is an actor, which I find the possibility of that really interesting, and the planet defending itself against what human beings are doing, which is really interesting in sort of taking away the agency, and I find it of human beings to a little degree, or maybe minimizing the effects that we think we have, that we're not as important as maybe we believe we are. In the grand scheme of things, like if we consider ourselves the only actors, the only people, or the only things with agency, then we would then therefore not, almost by definition, be overestimating our effect on other things.
I mean, as you're talking, what came to mind is that this way of thinking provides another opportunity for us to consider, well, just who are we and how are we really acting?
Right.
So if you look at how humans are acting, are we not? In many ways, are we not acting like an epidemic or a virus that just grows explosively without thought to resources, and then collapses and dies once everything has been consumed? And if that is, I don't find that a particularly appealing template for thinking about my species. So, potentially, I think this animal turn, or whatever we're going to call it, will hopefully engender in us potentially an intellectual modesty about our place on this, on the grand scheme of things, and on this planet and so on, that might make us somewhat better neighbors to that clump of lettuce in the garden next door.
Yeah. Well, and it sort of fits with the broader idea of, when you go to grad school, or the more you learn just in general, right? The more you learn, the more you figure out that you just don't really know anything.
Yeah.
Right? And this, to me, is a great example of that. Like, the more I've read about this and listening to you today, the more I realize of how little I actually know about a lot of these things, and that's sort of a really exciting thing, right? It's a really exciting possibility.
I'd rather live in that world than one where we've got it all figured out.
Yeah. But in terms of history, though, with the digital tools, with this thing, you teach at Brock, I've taught here, I teach at Carleton. How then do we take these ideas and try to implement them with students who, now not all students, but a lot of students come into the room at the first day of a class, and the primary concern is what's on the exam, right? And how they're going to do in the class. How do we take these ideas, implement them when we're talking with students, and try to have students engage with some of these big ideas while still getting across the core curriculum that we want to get across? Like, if you're in Canadian History 101, there are certain things that you need to talk about.
Yeah.
Or is this something or is it something that maybe we're just not far enough along in the process? And I've always found, and certainly I'm relatively new to this, but that the teaching is a few years behind where the scholarship is. Always, there's always a natural lag. Because to me, one of the things for me, academic historians, I think the biggest audience for academic historians are our students.
Yeah.
And I try with something like this to get larger audiences outside of the classroom, but for most of us, the largest groups that we're going to be talking to are our students, and if these are the big ideas in the discipline, then certainly we would want our students to learn about them.
Yeah, we would. In terms of some elements aren't going to be all that hard to integrate, I think, into our standards accounts. The fall of Rome, well, we're going to give, say, a lecture on the fall of Rome and why it happened, and, it would just be another dot or two on the historiographical chain. So Rome fell because of a lack of moral virtue, so saith, I don't know, Gibbon or whoever. Rome fell because of economic overreach, so
Right.
says whomever. And now people are saying, well, Rome fell because of climate change and disease. And so recognizing that element of, shall we say, animal agency or ecosystem agency doesn't strike me as that hard. In terms of dealing with the larger, shall we say, philosophical implications and how that's either going to affect the future trajectory of the discipline or how we teach, I don't know, but no one person needs to figure it out. I think it's just like any other new intellectual movement. There will be people who are deeply invested in it, some who find it appalling.
Right.
We will have our various conferences and so on, and things will sift and sort themselves out over time, likely after I retire, so I don't really need to worry about it.
All right, well, for you personally then, we talked before that you do a lot with virtual reality, augmented reality, these sorts of issues. You're very heavily invested in these digital tools. How does this new turn, these new approaches then, influence those digital projects that you're working on?
To be honest, I'm still trying to figure that out. But what I would say is that a lot of the work that I'm doing with the digital side of things, I'm targeting now more towards the Niagara region.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means for me is I'm quite interested in, my immediate project right now is I want to create a historical GIS database of the Niagara region. And I would say, just by virtue of the things that I've been learning about the animal turn, I'm going to be far more sensitive to, say, the medical history and the environmental history of the region than I would have been before, and for that matter, the agricultural history of the region. I'm going to likely have a set of questions I did not have before. But, in terms of moving forward on the digital space, for me, a lot of it right now, I'm at a stage where a lot of my work is just going to be getting the data in a format where it can be treated by computation.
Right.
So, creating an adequate historical GIS database, that is a multi-year effort. That's like 7 years of work. My colleague Don Lafreniere is well along in creating a database for Michigan, and he's about halfway through a 7-year effort. He's my guide for a lot of things in the GIS, and he's got a team of about 12 or 13 people working to construct this thing. So for a substantial part of the remainder of my career, my concern is going to be just to get that data in place, and then use of it will have to come with others who then make use of that data. But part of the reason I'm invested in historical GIS is that it seems to me that there is use for that data that's it's going to be useful not only for historians, but potentially for practitioners in medicine. There are people in the field of epidemiology who are interested in historical GIS, its data, and what it has to contribute, potentially in terms of fields like urban planning, dealing with the effects of transportation infrastructure, potentially even business analytics. There might be a connection there. So there are all sorts of, there are potential uses for historical GIS, and my general sense is that that data needs to be digitized,
Right.
and that's something where, for my part, I see it as a public good. And it's potentially something that history departments across the country can take the lead in terms of working with their communities to create, and I hope they do.
Right, but as you say, it's a long-term project and therefore a very expensive project
Yeah.
as well. So what sort of role then does that play in an environment in which, I don't know if historical consciousness is decreasing, but certainly enrollments are decreasing, and history departments are having trouble with staffing and things like this, and yet we want to take on these large projects. Like, how do we manage to do that in a way that both fits our needs as historians, but also the practical needs of administrators?
I've thought a lot about that, and history has a lot to contribute to other domains.
Sure, yeah.
And if we can find ways to link that historical sense with other domains, even in business, the field of business analytics, you actually need people who do well in that actually have a sense of history about them. They think in historical terms. They have historical analogs that they can draw on to try and interpret their data. If you don't have anything in your brain, you can have all the data you want. You need something to help you make sense of it, to interpret it, to suggest where you go next. Connecting history with a domain like business analytics, or a domain like urban planning, or forecasting, in whatever sphere you want, whether it's the social, public, or private sectors. The history still offers some pretty valuable skills, and it's just a matter of finding a way to create a viable roadmap for students who are taking history to understand that once they leave our charge, there's a viable roadmap for them to find some good jobs. But they have to, this is terminology I hate, but the contemporary parlance says there are two sets of skills that students need to acquire at the university level. One are soft skills, and the other are hard skills. We purportedly provide the soft skills. I don't like the term because, frankly, what we offer is damn hard to learn.
Yes, it is.
And so it strikes me as a rather poor term for what it is that we are offering. The hard skills, then, are the more technical skills. And some of those we can actually offer because they make sense to offer to incorporate them in terms of supporting our research or our teaching. Some of which are things like GIS, because GIS is not all that different in principle than the analytics software that somebody in business is going to use. Things like simulations. Potentially that's going to be a very useful field for people in this city that's concerned. You're going to have lots of government departments that are concerned about public safety and so forth. And
absolutely,
having a knowledge about how to create simulations could potentially be very useful for them. So I think as a profession, we still have a lot to offer. We just have to be creative in finding connections between what it is that we concern ourselves with, the kinds of skills that we develop, and how those connect with what that student is going to be facing once that student faces the job market.
Right. So this is an interesting sort of dynamic. To me, I was just in Belgium and France with the Vimy Foundation, with a group of high school kids from across the country. We started in Ypres, and we worked our way through essentially a battlefield tour, but frankly it was mostly cemeteries that we would visit for all First World War. We didn't do any Second World War stuff. And what was interesting to me, and I've noticed this more and more as I've taught more students, is that we can say that, however many hundreds of thousands of people died and millions of casualties when injured and all that. But the thing that the students really take away from it, or where they really got emotional, is every one of them had to do a project about one soldier who was buried somewhere in Belgium or France. And we went to the cemeteries, we found the headstones of those individuals, and the students gave a presentation about the person at their headstone.
Wow.
And it was very powerful. And sort of the more we did it, the first few presentations weren't all that emotional, but the more we did it, the students got more and more emotional as they learned more about the war and the conditions and everything that was going on. And so much so that the last day when we were at Vimy, because a few people selected individuals who had not been found, so we were at the Vimy Memorial, and they presented at Vimy in front of the name that was etched for those who were never found. And so the whole group got really emotional because of the last day sort of built up. But it struck me as what becomes really moving to students, and I think to a lot of us sometimes too, are those micro histories, where we learn about the individuals, we learn the stories of what this person did at this time, and we can create a connection with them in some way. Like a lot of the students pick people who went to their high schools, right? And the students who I'm there with are ranging from 14 or 15 to 17. So the 17-year-olds are pretty much on the verge of the same age as a lot of the people who were seen. We saw the tomb of a 15-year-old, for instance, right? And so you create a connection one-on-one, but then we also like this big data that, to me, gets away from those individual micro-personalized stories that are so compelling on a one-on-one basis. And there's almost a disconnect in my mind between those two things, that we can learn so much from the data and this mapping and all this stuff, and it's very illuminating. But a lot of the core of what the discipline is are those micro-histories and creating that connection with the past. And I'm just wondering for you, someone who deals a lot with a lot of this data, if you have found that as well, or if I'm just sort of talking out of nothing here, and if that does exist, how do we then address it so that when we go to the public with this big data, it doesn't fall on deaf ears of just like, oh, that's just a lot of numbers, that you can still somehow personalize it or connect it in some way?
I think it's a fairly simple solution. I mean, you know, as you well know, I mean, the profession was massively divided on what is the proper focus of history. Yeah. So we had the social science history of the 60s, and then the 70s comes along, and you know, the microhistory comes in, and we have you know, individuals say, well, basically the proclamation that individuals matter and we need to be paying attention and doing due justice to them. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the battles had to do with, well, what is real history? And you know, there were the scholars from the 60s were adapting the mantle of the science and saying, we're doing the real history here, and this is based on quantitative data, and so aren't we cool because we're being like scientists and using numbers? And others got very defensive, and then there were political fireworks associated with studies of slavery and what was being said there, and that made a lot of computationally based history quite toxic. You know, personally, it strikes me as just common sense. Why wouldn't you look at history at both levels?
Right, yeah.
I don't see a competition here. It seems to me that both are equally fundamental parts of history. We want to know something about the grand currents and sweeps of history. That just makes sense. We're all affected by them. Mm-hmm. But we also want to know how people on the ground are affected by them. Industrialization, well, how's that going to help or hurt somebody? Cultural trends like prohibition, well, how are people reacting on the ground to that? Right. You know, I think you're right. In terms of a personal investment in history, we connect better with people at the individual level. But we also, I think, want a knowledge of that surround, of that background, mm-hmm. of, you know, what is happening in the larger economy or the larger culture and so on. And so, you know, as historians, we just try to do justice to our craft as storytellers, which, right. You know, we are still in the business of telling stories. Mm-hmm. Yes, we tell interpretations and analyses and so on, but we're still trying to put all the pieces together in a compelling manner that's going to matter to somebody. So that means at some juncture we are still very much storytellers, and we have to pay attention to both sides of the divide.
Is there a competition, though, for attention, say public attention, between the macro and the micro that could be a concern? I mean, yes, you can go to something like CHA, and there's space for everything, absolutely. But I just wonder, in the public arena, is there a competition for attention and for what people are going to attach themselves to? And the best way to tell, is the best way to tell the big sweep of history, like this big data, is it through one example of it, right? I always think of, like, you know, when there's a natural disaster, right? People always find one picture of one person, and that becomes almost the symbol of the larger scope. And I wonder if that's something in history that we could do, maybe not amongst academic historians at conferences or anything like that, but in presenting these ideas to the public.
Sure. You know, I wish I could be a little more loquacious than that, but sure. You know, I think you can potentially make any approach to history or any level of history interesting or topical or compelling, and it really comes down to how good a storyteller, how good a presenter you are, the kinds of analogies, the kind of language, all those kinds of things. Really comes down to your communication skills. You know, whichever becomes the most relevant or practical in the public mind, well, I leave that to the public to decide. And, you know, I do the best as a historian as I can to just do justice to what I know and to point to what seems to me most important in terms of whatever it is I'm trying to explain.
All right, now in that realm, well, let's talk a little bit about what you do in addition to the digital stuff. I want to talk Harold Innis a little bit.
All right.
Harold Innis is a figure. You've written about Harold Innis. It was your most recent book, right?
Yeah, I wrote a book called Emergence and Empire.
Yes. So why has Harold Innis Because so I do communication stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Harold Innis so hard for people to really wrap their heads around?
Because he was an awful writer. It really is that as simple as that. He was he had a very hard time in putting forward a coherent narrative, and he spoke in a very cryptic fashion. He often didn't make plain the analytical apparatus that he was asking you to follow, or that he was using to structure his history. And so that has made it a very difficult set of texts for scholars and the public to engage with. One of the big arguments in the Harold Innis literature is there's something more underneath what apparently is readily accessible on the surface. And there are some who have denied that, and there are others, myself among them, who believe no, there actually is a very sophisticated theory and philosophy of history underlying what Harold Innis had to say. It requires, doing what the due diligence you would associate with Harold Innis. I mean, you read his texts, you read his underlying letters, you read his unpublished writings, you put all these things together, and at least personally, it seemed to me there was actually a fairly coherent system of history or thought about history that is there. I maintain that Harold Innis was very much interested in the kinds of things we would call self-organization, complex systems, how they emerge, how they crash, how they evolve over time. That's something that was not new to him. That's a set of concerns he inherited from Adam Smith, and then through Smith, Thorstein Veblen. And it was a template of history that he used both in his Staples hypothesis and also in his communication writings. And one of the I'd say shortcomings that I saw in a lot of the Harold Innis literature is that a lot of the communication writing or work on his communication work pays minimal or no attention to Harold Innis, the economist, and the set of ideas that he was dealing with as an economist. And to my mind, that is a mistake, in large measure, because Innis, in his writings, made very plain, look, I'm an economist, I'm using economic tools, this is what I'm using to make sense of the world's cultural past.
Right.
They're there, they're latent, they can be discovered, and that's something I tried to do in my treatment of Innis.
That's interesting, because as you say that, you're absolutely right. Like, we sort of have Innis Staples in his communications, and yet we don't tend to put them together. And I think one of the reasons for me is, as you say, he's a terrible writer. Like, it's so hard. I hate reading Harold Innis stuff. It's so terrible to read it. Although I'll say I think it's easier to read the Staples stuff than it is to read the communication stuff. The communication stuff is just, it's so dense and so hard to get through. But does that make Harold Innis a bad historian? Was he a bad historian? Because if you can't communicate effectively and all this time later we're still arguing about what you were trying to say, does that compromise the actual message?
Well, I think, but it certainly, if we if we count a good historian as somebody who can communicate effectively, well, Harold Innis didn't do himself any favors in that score. If we count a good historian as somebody who is conveying interesting ideas about history, applying context to see, or interesting concepts to see if they have any purchase. I mean, what Ennis was doing was taking concepts from the domain of economics and applying them to the span of global history to see if they work. So he was being an adventurous historian.
Yes.
From that standpoint, I think he presented Canadian letters with a set of interesting things, a set of interesting propositions, about how to think about the global past, about how to think about communication technologies and their impact on us in the present. One of the most valuable legacies that I take from Ennis is that there's a great deal of concern in the present about information overload and, oh my God, social media, and isn't this scrambling around with our brains, and isn't all this horrible? Well, if you read Ennis, And you read about what people had to say about newspapers in the 19th century. Oh my God, there's all this information. This is scrambling with our brains. Isn't this horrible? And one of the things that I've taken from Ennis is that for whatever reason, humans tend to have this very ambivalent, almost fearful attitude towards their communication technologies. And they're always worried about the new innovation.
Yes.
They're always worried about what it's going to do to how we think and the kinds of people that we're going to become. And, Ennis himself points that out. He points to Plato and the Phaedrus, and there's this dialogue where one character is saying, you young people in your writing, you watch out, it's going to lead you to no good. The oral traditions were that's going to make you, decent, wise, and, effective human beings. And it just seems to me that, today's discourse about technology is just a lot of more of the same.
Right.
What I take from Ennis is that I don't see any communication technology, including artificial technology or artificial intelligence, as being something that is an overweening threat that is going to be our undoing. We've adapted to new technologies in the past. We're going to adapt to these ones, and it's just a matter of facing the problem and using our ingenuity. And if we do that, we're going to be fine.
Yeah, and that's a good takeaway, I think, from what it is, because, like you say, there's so much tension about technology, but the tension has always been there with technology.
Absolutely.
It's never gone away, and it's always going to continue. And the story I tell my students all the time in my radio course is a story from the World's Fair. I can't remember, whichever year it was in New York, which I want to say 39, but I'm not entirely sure. But there was an individual, an old woman there, who was at the fair, and they were demonstrating radio to her, and she didn't believe it. She just did not believe it. She said must be someone behind the booth or something, and they showed her, there's no one there, and then she said, okay, fine, it's a ghost. It has to be paranormal. But it speaks to the tension that exists with new technologies, and the way in which we have to adapt, and another way, the way people always talk, their grandparents can't send them an email or whatever it is, right? It's this idea of where the tension is, and who gets to be included, who doesn't get to be included, and that challenge, and that's a universal thing, and it's happened for thousands of years. I'm sure when the first person brought back a knife, everyone else was like, "What are you doing?"
That's right.
Right? Of course.
That's right. But I do find it interesting. We tend to tell ourselves stories, particularly about the young generation and their interaction with technology. Mm-hmm. So when I grew up, it was television that was ruining young people.
Right.
Okay, and making us vapid whatevers. And now the current discourse is about people and games and texting and so on. Yeah. And I'd say one of the most absurd manifestations of that is this characterization. You and I lived before the cell phone, so we're digital immigrants.
Right.
The millennials are the digital natives. And their brains are configured. They're a different order of human beings from the rest of us. And that just strikes me as so much hyperbole. And the millennial is, they're going to have to pay the bills. They're going to eat Chinese food when they're 50. I just don't see this notion that somehow technology is reconfiguring us into some sort of fundamentally different animal than we are. The same concerns about what texting is doing now to people were expressed by people about individuals reading small, brief columns in the newspaper. It was going to make them superficial. It was going to give them a limited attention span. They were only going to be thinking incoherent bites. All of these kinds of things, and I just see it as a lot of silliness that we'll forget about in 20 years from now, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, there's a great meme on the internet of people on a bus in the 50s and they're all reading their own newspaper. And the meme is something along the lines of, tell me again about how cell phones have made us not want to talk to each other, right? That's what's made us antisocial. But that brings us, I think, just sort of full circle to where we started in terms of what happened today with the digital history stuff. That I had a chance to see some of the projects. I saw you going around to some of the projects, and some of the stuff that these students are doing with these tools are really remarkable. And to me, I'm not that old, right? I I've only been out of the PhD for 4 years, whatever it's been, but the change in what is possible for students now versus when I was, forget an undergrad, even when I was doing the PhD, like the speed with which these tools are being implemented and used by these students, it's really quite remarkable. And the possibilities for engagement and learning are really remarkable. And I think that the discipline, therefore, is in a really good state. All we have to do now, as we talked about earlier, is let people know that this is happening.
Yes.
And hopefully get people invested. But I'm really optimistic. And days like today make me even more optimistic.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And it seems to me that now the barriers to getting into the digital space are a lot lower than they were when I started out. I started my career as I finished my PhD in 2001 and worked as a grad student in the late 1990s. And then getting into something like 3D modeling or GIS, that was still a pretty expensive proposition.
Right.
But now, companies are giving their software almost away to particularly the education institutions. They're not doing it for their health. They're doing it because they want students to become adept at their software and invested in it and take that into the workplace. But whatever. It's a lot easier to acquire 3D content. There's a lot more support on YouTube or places like that for learning how to use these technologies. And it really just comes down to people, scholars making the decision, okay, I'm going to integrate this into my teaching and taking the time to, there are lots of summer school courses around now to make it easier for people to work, to participate in the digital space. So for example, I teach at the Digital Historical Summer Institute in Victoria, a 3D modeling course every year. The University of Ottawa here has a digital history, DH Site, I believe it's called, or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And they get to go around and do different things with different... I think there's one professor, but they always bring in different people to teach different skills. They get to do some museum work too.
But there is now a lot more support to help people get into that digital space, to incorporate that into their teaching than there used to be. The software is less expensive, and it really is coming down to you, I, or somebody else making the decision that this will be helpful. And and on the basis that really is the ultimate marker for whether the digital ought to be brought into a classroom or not. Is this going to be helpful? Is this going to teach something that is useful? Is this going to contribute to a student's knowledge and practice of the discipline that we are teaching? And it really comes down to, if the answer is yes, by all means go for it. If the answer is no, if this is just something where lots of people are doing it because it's fashionable, then don't do it.
Right.
We're all busy. We don't have the time.
Yeah, and I know for me personally, like I've started having students at my courses at Carleton, their final projects are to do podcasts. It's a radio class, so I say create a radio show, a historical radio show. And I know even with me, like 4 years ago, I gave a workshop on how to do recording, how to create a podcast, and I had to sort of walk everybody through it. Last semester in the fall, I had a class dedicated to it, and everyone said, "Yeah, we know how to do this already. You don't need to do this." So like that change was really remarkable. But at the same time, like I've had students come up to me after the semester, and this is going to sound self-aggrandizing, but I don't mean it in that way. And they say to me that we really like this project because it lets us express our ideas, express what we learned. But I'm not a strong writer, so here's another tool that I now have to express the ideas, and it's good to know that I just have to work on my writing. It's not actually an intellectual problem, it's a writing problem. And that sort of stuff I think is really interesting to me to also reimagine for us as historians the way in which we can disseminate our information. And if it's not always the written word, that's fine, because there's so many possibilities.
Well, and that is an interesting issue. I mean, I've been heavily invested in my own work in the idea that content expression in this century is going to become increasingly multimodal.
Yes.
So, in any typical historical monograph, what are we looking at? Maybe 97% text, maybe a map or two, some photos, and that is the sum of the matter. That is the way we have done it. That has been a fruitful way to do it. It's also been a cost-efficient way to disseminate content. But that it needn't be the case now. So with computation, with tools where the cost of producing content is diminishing, their ease of use is also becoming more user-friendly with all those kinds of things. Is it beyond the realm of possibility to conceive of a major historical work that is an amalgam of text, of video, of animations, of audio, all of those types of things, and that is the basis for composition? It doesn't strike me as an absurd idea. In the medieval era, there was something called emblematic literature. Francis Bacon wrote a defense of it. Part of the reason he said that emblems were useful is they communicated concepts more easily. They were more easily apprehended than textual representations. And that's always seemed to me a pretty profound insight. If one mode of expressing an idea or a concept is not particularly useful or difficult to apprehend, why on earth would we not then use a different communication formalism to express that idea? So if a visual representation of some historic process is a more effective means of communicating that idea, potentially in conjunction with, say, a sound narration, well, then why wouldn't we do that?
Right.
And a lot of it just has to do with habit, what we characterize as scholarly and so on. But to me, in principle, there's no reason why we shouldn't do that, and I rather expect ultimately at some point we will do that. It's just a matter of evolving practice and what we deem to be scholarly. And there's also the issue of knowing how to present that content in a scholarly format. So I can present a building or an urban landscape, and I will have my historical colleagues say, well, how do you know it looked like that?
Right.
Prove it to me,
Yes.
right? And one of the key challenges that we have in multimodal communication is that we don't know how to document that content.
Right.
The way I say it is, how do you footnote a building?
Yes. Yeah, it's very difficult to do.
Well, people are talking about that idea, but how to go about doing that is something it's not in principle an impossible idea. People invented the footnote. People can invent novel methods for accounting for both the provenance of their data and what they did with it.
Right.
It's just a matter of figuring it out. But once that is figured out, and I expect in future it will, what then hinders us from using multimodal content? Well, I don't think there is anything in principle to stop us from doing that, aside from knowing how to produce that content and a general acceptance by the profession that this is a legitimate way to communicate.
Right. I think the latter of those is probably one of the biggest ones, although it's starting to shift, I've noticed. I'm happy that there are people in the world like I call them other Sean Graham, and Ian Milligan, yourself, who are within the academy already saying we don't have to do it the old way. Like, the old way is fine. Like, if you want to write a book, that's fine. I mean, I just had a book come out in November. Books are fun. I like books. Like, I'm not against books, but there's other ways to disseminate information than just books.
Yes. And I have a few thousand myself, so I happen to be a fan.
Yeah.
But that being said, there are potentially different ways to reconstruct or represent the past, and it really comes down to why would we not avail ourselves of those expressive possibilities.
Right.
And if it is useful to so do, then by all means we should so do, and we just it will come down to the culture of the discipline will need to change, but as I think you're suggesting, that is beginning to change. I mean, when I began this in the late 90s, and I'd tell a senior professor in the discipline what I was doing, almost invariably there'd be a chortle and the word Nintendo would come out.
Right, yeah.
The elision with gaming, the meaning of the professor's comments were quite plain. But now, 4 years ago, or what was it? I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, I was shocked to get an invitation from the Journal of the Canadian Historical Association I hadn't prompted it.
Right.
One of the editors had attended the talk where I'm talking like I'm talking now and asked me to contribute an article. So that indicated to me that there was a sea change, and that it is a sea change. There are editors of my cohort and younger now that are starting new staff journals, and I think that's going to have a bearing on how the communicative practices of the discipline are going to evolve in the years ahead.
Right. And too, I mean, we should also note too, I mean, there's a lot of books that aren't any good too, right? So just because you produce a book doesn't mean it's good, the same way that with these other devices, it has to be good. It has to be of quality to be of value, really. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And a lot of it just has to do with culture. And I mean, even in disciplines where graphic content is deemed to be important. My colleague Diane Favreau at UCLA wrote a very interesting article where she described, she had been part of a collaborative team called Rome Reborn, where they had created the reconstruction of ancient Rome during, I think it was the time of the Emperor Trajan or something like that. So a big, impressive rendition of what the city looked like back then.
Yeah.
And they brought in, what she found very interesting is they ended up bringing in individuals from a variety of different disciplines, architectural history, classics, and so forth. And the conventions that those people adhered to and deemed to be indicative of rigorous content were very, very different. Some scholars would say, well, you shouldn't have texture and color on your maps. They should just, a good scholarly model is only just a line drawing looking like an architectural drawing. That's an objective rendition of what the building looked like. Then the next group would say, where's the color on this? This doesn't look like a model. This is no good. What are you people doing? There was no common conception of what a scholarly model looked like. Right. It all had to do with institutional norms, the history of the discipline, and so on. So, I guess my plea to my colleagues is, yes, we have norms that we follow. Yes, we have communication practices that we follow. And they're very good. The knowledge gets around.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we have to stop at those, and I don't think we should stop at those. At some juncture, our definition as a culture is going to change. Computer programming, it wouldn't surprise me in a century now if that is an established literacy,
that's what we teach
numeracy.
5-year-olds. Yeah,
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
So in a world where you have practitioners like that, the expressive possibilities are going to be much larger for that person who takes computer programming for granted. And if that is the case, I expect then the expressive trajectory of our discipline is going to become very, very different as a result.
Yeah, and you started your talk today by saying you don't like to make predictions, but
boy, am I going against what I said.
But I really enjoyed this, and I'm going to let you go now because there's apparently a pub situation.
We got to keep our priorities straight.
That I don't want to keep you from. But I very much appreciate the time this afternoon talking about sort of where the state of the discipline is, and I really enjoyed this. So John Bonnett, Brock University, thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Sean. I enjoyed it too.
If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, it's historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.